Huh? Where am I? Oh, hello. You've come to watch a video. I'm sorry, I must have lost track of time. Has this ever happened to you? Games these days are using every trick in the book to suck you in and create fun, addictive gameplay that never ceases. We know when it happens, but we don't know why. And this recent game, Outpath, will suck you dry. Okay, well, let's get into it. Satisfaction in games is virtually a necessity, where every action in the game must be tangible. You're likely familiar with the term game juice that often expresses these effects and stimulation in a game that rewards players for completing actions. It was coined in 2005 after a group of 4 graduate students developed 50 games in one semester. This led to some successes but far more failures. However, their insights were proven incredibly notable as their vocabulary persists today. Game juice, they discovered, was vital to making games satisfying to play. They deduced a game must have strong art, gameplay, and juice, but when developing a game in a few days, often they'd try an idea that simply didn't work. However, they'd brute force it to the finish line by stuffing it with good game juice. They found that these games weren't great, the gameplay was bad, but they felt good to play and oftentimes more fun than games with better gameplay and less juice. This weird abstract concept of juice is often interpreted as particle effects and screen shake. However, it can be easy to not notice a little bit of UI work or gun recoil that's added for the benefit of the game feel rather than the gameplay. Here is a simple idle game I made for a cookie clicker video that never ended up coming to fruition. We can see the framework is there. As we increase our score, we can purchase upgrades that hastens the increase of the score in a perpetual cycle. It's incredibly dull and lifeless, and the enjoyment of watching the number go up is soon lost. It's easy to see that this game is missing game juice, but it's hard to point that all out. However, if we compare it to a game like Cookie Clicker, we can see it's missing a whole lot of things. First is the cookie swishing in and out when we click it. Then is the +1 that floats up indicating how much we hit it for, as well as the sound the cookie makes, the cookies in the background as production increases, the highlighting of upgrades as they become available, and the cookies falling from your cursor. This incessant stimulation is vital for capturing players and adding tangibility to their actions to incentivize them further. We can see this trend for satisfying interaction on media in the recent phenomenon of oddly satisfying videos, where an action like cutting soap or playing with slime can tickle our brains. They use clear visual and auditory cues to elicit a response so visceral that we almost feel as if we're doing it ourselves. And it makes a lot of sense to extend that to playing a video game, because then that satisfaction further realizes the game experience for us. The haptic feedback on the controller adds weight to the sword we swing, or ding of a coin reaffirms we collected it. And that's all certainly a part of satisfaction, the kind of satisfaction that will draw you in and keep hitting you with dopamine. However, not only does a satisfying game require an immense and instinctive response to each action, but a consistent level of enjoyment where you find it difficult to pull yourself from the game loop. The phrase game loop or gameplay loop is often contested due to its ambiguity and versatility of interpretations. For example, we have the input feedback loop that links back to game juice, we have the actual code looping in the background 60 times a second, and we have the cycle of achieving a goal in order to reveal the next goal. We care most about that last one. Like Minecraft, your main goal might be to conquer the Ender Dragon, but although that's the overarching conquest, you're not actually thinking about that for most of the game. The game gives you smaller goals to strive for in a really seamless way, by dropping you near trees to chop down, to make a wooden pickaxe to mine stone, to make a stone pickaxe to mine iron, and so on. The deconstruction of a goal broken into smaller goals is inherent when we do anything. When I'm going for a run and I'm wheezing and dying after the first 500 meters, I don't say to myself, great, only like 20 minutes to go. I have the classic mindset of, I just have to get to that pole. And this being the way our brain works, games that aren't able to simultaneously introduce an overarching goal and a series of smaller goals can lose players. Like once a year, my mates and I will re-download Clash of Clans with the intent of getting really into it and becoming the best to ever do it. I'm sure you're all familiar with the end to this story. Within weeks, we lose interest. There's a couple of reasons why Clash of Clans captures only the most dedicated players, and one of them is that the small goals are deceptively difficult and time-consuming. We can consider the layer of goals players have when they're playing Clash of Clans in order of the amount of time it takes to accomplish them. Winning a battle to get loot, upgrading defenses to max out your town hall, upgrading your town hall to get better defenses and troops. Although that's a pretty reductive depiction, you can clearly see that the only goal that can be achieved during one play session is the first one, and everything else requires requires a constant commitment. That does make each goal that much more satisfying to achieve, however, it runs the risk of players losing engagement because the speed at which they're being rewarded for playing the game turns from instantaneous during the first few hours to every few days. And so, a satisfying gameplay loop, especially one on PC, simply requires far quicker progression to each goal to keep the player engaged. A good measure of this is if there's always something achievable to do in a game. Story games and sandbox games can do this really well because in a story there's always the next quest, and sandbox games always have some area you haven't discovered or some resource you need to get. But a game like Factorio, as fun as it is during the initial phase of exponential growth, quickly seems insurmountable as your production slowly becomes unable to keep up with requirements, and you have to spend hours creating a factory to hit the next target. I feel like we all have those games that we'd love to complete, however progression just slows down so drastically that it becomes hard to get through. As you can imagine, long, grindy games suffer from this the most. But when you get it right, like the first few hours of Factorio, you get into the flow state. It sounds like a colloquial term, but this PhD manages to condense it into 8 distinctive elements of flow experiences. 1. A task that can be completed. The ability to concentrate on the task. That concentration is possible because the task has clear goals. That concentration is possible because the task provides immediate feedback. The ability to exercise a sense of control over actions. A deep but effortless involvement that removes awareness of the frustrations of everyday life. Concern for self disappears, but sense of self emerges stronger afterwards. And the sense of duration of time is altered. And hey, that kind of alludes to game juice, doesn't it? Immediate feedback can be the infamous game juice, but the fact that the flow experience can be summed up so succinctly doesn't necessarily mean it's as seamless to implement. More often than not, games fail to seduce me into this experience, and I find myself aware of disinterest and even boredom. This will happen less often if you tend to stick to AAA titles, but if you're not afraid to pick up a game with only a couple of reviews, you are running the risk of playing something that is just inherently dull. So, the perpetual cycle of satisfying gameplay can now be denoted as a flow experience, and any game either flows or it doesn't, at least to most players. Of course, there is no universal flow experience just because everyone is so nuanced. However, there are certainly games like Stardew Valley and Minecraft that are able to capture masses with their flow experiences. It's also worth noting that each point has a spectrum from true to false. There's not necessarily a distinct answer. For example, certain players will find it easier to concentrate on a larger and more ambiguous goal, while other players will find it easier to hone in on a small, tangible goal. Players are versatile. Now this experience is articulated, we can delve into why it's so successful in Outpath. Outpath is a self-described experimental clicker base building game. This is an incredibly strange combination of genres, and anyone familiar with Forager will be aware of how addictive this combination can be. So, you start on a small island containing trees, grass, berry bushes, and the occasional copper ore. You'll learn to click on these objects over and over to break them for resources, kind of like Minecraft. As you play, you will unlock stations to craft various objects at, such as food items, weapons, tools, and magic items. Similar to Forager, the amount of different crafting stations you require increases as time goes on, to the point where you have an entire tree of stations to research and learn to build and use. We also have a currency, credits, that's used for expanding your islands, researching new builds, and upgrading the skills you find on the islands. These skills range from bare-bones quality of life features like running faster and the ability to hold the mouse button down rather than to click, to gameplay-altering changes like chests appearing and the ability to deal critical damage to an object. And what happens is you're introduced with an incredibly bare-bones tutorial, and the incentive to discover most things for yourself. In doing so, you learn to upgrade your tools, expand your island, and eventually discover more islands with tougher resources and new opportunities. It's hard to tell if this gameplay loop is so predictable because it's been done before, or if this incremental manner of improvement is just how our brain likes to think about things. And who better to talk about Outpath than the developer? So I reached out to the developer, David, over Discord, and he told me that he was more than happy to do a written interview. So let's start with the tutorial, or lack thereof. Consider a newer game .age. Pretty much the first playthrough, upwards of 10 hours, is a tutorial for your future runs. However, Outpath is almost completely bereft of a tutorial. When asking him why that was, David said, "I hate tutorials in video games. When I was younger, it was fun to discover how the game was played, how things worked. Nowadays, people don't have too much time to waste on a single game, so I am forced to make at least a simple tutorial explaining the basics. Tutorials in video games is always a point of contention because some games are unplayable without them, and others have far too long an introduction. Outpath treads the line so well, not only because David is so keenly aware of the enjoyment of discovery, but also because of the game's relative simplicity. Once you get through that tutorial, a few lines of text, you're fully in the game, and you're subject to the addictive gameplay. But what makes that gameplay so addictive? Of course, the implementation of game juice is a large aspect of making the game feel good. David said, you can make a game 100% feel better just adding the correct juice. But going overboard can also be very annoying and distracting for some people, so you just have to do it well. But I think what I found most interesting about David's development process was the distinction he made between fun and addictive games. Making a fun game is really difficult, so I chose to make it addictive. I researched a lot about human psychology, addictions, experiments, and I did a game with that base in mind. This is immediately apparent if you play the game. Every action feels absolutely fine-tuned to generate the perfect amount of stimulation without going overboard. The consistent discovery the game creates maintains that addictive gameplay loop throughout the whole game, with just the right amount of content where you can reach the end without grinding or losing interest. And this enjoyment the entire way through leads me to believe that more often than not, addictive gameplay requires fun gameplay. Outpath is ultimately a fantastic game that I still can't put down, despite having completed the main sequence of events. It's so special when you find that game that manages to capture your attention for just the right amount of time, where you can reflect fondly on it. Outpath is definitely one of those games, and you should definitely check it out if you haven't already, as well as subscribe to the YouTube channel, like, and send me $400 in cash to this address. See ya.